All right, let's delve right into it. And Riam, I'll start with you. The president has spoken about this, carbon credits. What really are carbon credits? Let's start from there.
Thank you, Trevor. Remember last time we talked, we thought, do we explain it to your grandmother or to my mother?
Let's try this now.
So let us try to do it in a very simplistic terms so that everybody could understand. Carbon credits is a certificate of 1 ton, representing 1 ton of CO2 that has either been removed or avoided from the atmosphere. Okay. What does that mean? Removed a tree, photosynthesis, remove CO2, and sequester it underneath the ground. That is removal. Avoid a cement plant, a filter. You avoid CO2 from going to the atmosphere. Yeah. And then you measure that and you issue carbon credits offsets. So that's in a very simple terms. Yeah. What is a carbon credit offset?
Okay. So how does this work in terms of organizations and individuals, or is it from the forest perspective?
It's, so like any market, there is 2 sides. Like when you go to a supermarket, there's an offer, a commodity to be sold, and there's a buyer and a seller. In this case, the commodity is the certificate, and the buyer would be companies that would like to accelerate their climate action by buying carbon credit offset to reduce their emissions next to their decarbonization. The seller would be project developer here in Kenya, like we're gonna hear from Chris soon, about projects that avoids or removes CO2 from the atmospheres.
Okay. Let me bring in James Mwangi on this. James, how do we take advantage of carbon markets?
Well, I think as a continent, Africa has a huge opportunity here. To what Riham is saying, what we're essentially saying is that the continent has, maybe broadly speaking, 3 ways that it can contribute. The first one is to avoid adding new emissions to the atmosphere by adopting new technologies like the ones that Chris and others are adopting that lower our own carbon footprint while allowing us to still achieve the same benefits. So we still cook, we get, actually we cook with cleaner materials and so on, but those cook stoves are more expensive. And so getting some subsidy from those who have emitted to help us reduce our emissions improves our own quality of life. The second thing we can do is we can in addition to avoiding emissions, we can remove emissions. So, for example, when we plant trees, when we engage in those types of activities. Let me pause there between those kind of 2 pathways. Yeah. If you think about where we are as a continent, we have an increasing population that is adopting a whole set of livelihood enhancements. The easiest emissions to avoid for the planet and the cheapest to avoid are the ones you haven't started doing yet. So actually using carbon credits to subsidize Africa's leapfrog to cleaner and greener technologies is extremely wise. Yeah. Then let's come to nature. When we avoid cutting down our trees, right? So we avoid reducing our carbon sinks, we're providing a service to the world. Right? We should be compensated for that because in many ways there's money to be made from cutting down that tree or damaging that ecosystem. Yeah. And secondly, we should go even further. We should be incentivizing our young people using those same carbon credit revenues to go out and plant trees. Yeah. So in a way, what carbon credits can do is create an economic reward for good climate behavior that we already in Africa do more than most other parts of the world, but could do even more of. Yeah. And they could also subsidize the adoption of those urgently needed green technologies for the mass populace.
But then how do you balance it so that it's not an us versus them conversation? Because the president mentioned that our carbon sinks are there, but we get nothing for it. So that it's not an accusation that you guys are emitting more and we are the ones who are emitting less, but then you guys are not paying us enough.
So paying us enough is exactly the point. Is at the end of the day, what needs to happen is all of the activity, all of the almost free public good that Africa and Africans are providing needs to be recognized and priced. And I think the challenge has been that the carbon market historically has had a number of structural problems, and we need to acknowledge them. The first of which is very little of Africa's activity is recognized and translated into credits. There is work that needs to be done that says this forest is being conserved. How is it being conserved? How do we allocate value to that? Or this clean cook stove is better than that cook stove over there, or this electric car is better than what would have been used in exchange. So we've not done enough to document and track the choices we are making that are good for the planet in order to bring new credits of the kind Reham is describing to the market. Okay. The second thing is, where that work has been done, very, very often, most of the value of the credit that's been paid is not paid to the communities that are doing the work. It's captured by people who did the work or intermediated it outside of the continent. All right. Recent data says less than 20% of the value of the average carbon credit reaches African communities. Okay. And the third problem is because so little value often reaches communities from bad projects. They're good projects, but because so little value reaches the communities, they don't do the things that were supposed to be incentivized by the credit. So the trees get cut down and so on. Okay. And you hear the accusations of greenwashing. Okay. Right? Because we did not actually do the thing, because the community wasn't being rewarded. All the middlemen were taking all the value. And we'll talk about that in just a bit. But Clarice, is there some policy gaps that you see or legal paperwork that needs to be done so that this is made easier and more seamless?
Yeah, I think I'll start off with what President Ruto just said today at the summit, where he said that this is a global challenge, and when the apocalypse comes, it will come for all of us. So we must act collectively. Yeah. And in recognition of that, we have had international frameworks. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change in 1992, that was the first one that the countries agreed to collectively act on climate change. We then had the Kyoto Protocol in 1997, and then we have the Paris Agreement in 2015. So we have the international architecture. Yeah. Now, how well does this international architecture come down to the local level or to the domestic level or to the national level in the case of countries in Africa is the question. And from what we are seeing is many countries have laws, yes, but few have explicit laws on carbon markets. And actually, African countries are only now beginning to set up carbon market-specific legislation. Okay. So I would say that these gaps in the legal and policy framework, to the extent that we have not explicitly talked about who owns a carbon credit, what is a carbon credit, how should the benefit sharing, which has just been mentioned now, how should it happen so that communities get their just compensation from these projects, hasn't happened. Okay. But having said that, it's important to point out that African countries are now having climate-specific legislation touching on carbon markets. And on Friday, President Ruto actually signed the Climate Change Amendment Bill, which is the first attempt at Kenya setting up a framework for carbon markets in the country. Okay. So that bill amends the Climate Change Act of 2016, which Kenya was the first country in Africa to have a Climate Change Act. And it now creates certain key provisions on how the carbon market engagement in the country would work. Okay. We have seen similar happening in Tanzania, where last year they had a explicit carbon trading regulation. We've seen similar in Zimbabwe. Now the question then comes in, how adequate are those frameworks to actually ensure that we stimulate investment in the carbon markets, as opposed to hinder and chase away investment. Okay. But at the same time, we have to strike a balance. It's not just about the investor, but also the community and how well are they catered for. Yeah. And overall, the aim of the carbon markets is really about environmental integrity. Yeah. For that reason, the legal frameworks we craft have to ensure that the carbon credits we claim are actually real carbon credits that are from real projects that actually reduce emissions or remove emissions as they claim they do. Okay. Speaking of reducing emissions, let me bring in Chris on this. And Chris, how do clean cook stoves work and how have they contributed to lowering carbon emissions, especially within regions where they rely on traditional cooking methods?
Yeah, Trevor, well, so let me back up to the problem first. Yeah. I mean, most families in Africa, as we know, still to this day have no other option but to cook on an open fire, often using wood that they've chopped down from a nearby forest. And I think we're all familiar with some of the health problems that come from this, from the smoke that's emitted from these cooking fires. We're familiar with some of the economic problems that come from this, with families paying great amounts to buy wood or charcoal. But what's often overlooked is the environmental and climate problems that are the result of the cooking crisis today. So deforestation in Africa, actually one of the leading causes is cooking. And it's caused by people going and chopping down forests because they have really no other choice, and burning the wood that they collect as fuel to cook. This is also a major climate problem. Cooking alone is accounting for around the same amount of global greenhouse gas emissions as the entire aviation industry. So we hear a lot about how the aviation industry needs to reform and reduce emissions. We don't hear so much about the cooking crisis and how that's creating a large amount of CO2 emissions as well. So that's the backdrop to the problem. Where companies like Burn come in is we produce the cleanest, most efficient, most durable cook stoves that we can to use fuel very, very efficiently, or to eliminate the use of like non-sustainable wood or charcoal fuels entirely. And this has a corresponding reduction in emissions. So our stoves can reduce CO2 and greenhouse gas emissions by anywhere from 50 to 80% over a traditional cooking fire, and this makes them a really crucial climate solution.
Okay. All right, we'll come into that conversation in just a bit and continue with the conversations on this. But for now, let's talk about something else here, and we'll come back to that conversation now that you understand what carbon credits are and how it works.